People of Reddit who work the day shift at non-haunted businesses and don't spend all your time in the woods, what's the creepiest thing you've experienced? Every few months, in a department with over 20 women, we'd all come in nearly identical outfits. It was odd. We were all ages and races and styles, but there'd be a day when everyone would show up in a black skirt and red blouse. A few months later, everyone in brown slacks and a cream-colored dress shirt. A few months later, gray skirt and black sweater. We could never figure out the trigger, TV show character looking fly in that outfit the night before, a visitor to the building who appeared polished nothing. Always creeped me out, as it seemed to represent some sort of groupthink or collective consciousness working on us. I am a teacher of adult students, and one student of mine is kind of intense and creepy. Actually, she's based at another school, but specifically started attending classes at my school after meeting me. When I first started, she kept giving me welcome presents as I was new to the country. Just simple things like food, postcards and books, which was a nice idea, but it seemed a little excessive. She added me on social media and then got upset when I didn't reply to her constant messages. I told her that I don't really use social media. Anyway, I didn't see her for a few months and figured she'd just gone back to her own school or stopped studying or whatever, and was relieved that she'd clearly got bored of me. But then last week she comes in and gives me an envelope full of photos of me during lessons that she'd taken without me knowing. I was a little weirded out to say the least. Edit. I wouldn't worry about me too much, guys. The girl's creepy, but she's just a young, 20s girl interested in the foreign teacher. No restraining order necessary. This is China and I get a lot of weird attention for being foreign here. This just happens to be one of the more standout cases. That being said, if you don't hear from me in 24 hours, well, you know what happened. Was out at lunch in Midtown Atlanta with some coworkers. We sat out on the patio. There are some high-rise condos right across the street. Some guy jumped from his 40th floor balcony and splattered all over the roof of someone's Jetta. Everything went everywhere. The noise was pretty memorable as well. We noped out of there before ordering. It was a super silent ride back to work. One of my coworkers said he won't sit out on patios anymore when eating. I was playing the PC game Black and White, not a horror game, shortly after it came out. It was late at night and suddenly I hear my speakers whisper my name. There was no reason for it, nothing happened on screen, just my computer whispering my name. Scared the crap out of me. Years later I found out that they had recorded common names in one of the game files, and if the name on your profile matched a name they had recorded, it would have a small chance to randomly play while you were playing. Right after the Virginia Tech shooting, my old office got an anonymous death threat in the mail. Made of cut-up magazine letters, calling out the name of the office and its owners. They called the cops and closed the office for a couple days. Turned out to be from an employee who had just been fired for a number of reasons. Don't know what happened to her. I am fairly small for a guy. I stand at around 5'5", and the most I've ever weighed was around 150 pounds. About 6 or 7 years ago I didn't have my license despite being far old enough to drive, but a good buddy of mine wanted to hang out. He too did not have a way of transport, so we decided to both walk towards one another and meet in the middle. We would both be walking 5 miles. It was 3 a.m. on a cold winter night, and I was wearing a black jacket with my hood up. About 2 miles into my hike along the main road, a car pulled into a parking spot of a home I was passing, just a few feet behind me. He wasn't entirely into the driveway, almost halfway hanging out into the road. I half expected it was just a kind stranger wanting to give me a ride, but I wasn't about to take any rides from anybody. I kept pacing forward and ignored the car behind me, expecting them to roll down a window and shout at me. It didn't happen. The car just sat at the edge of that driveway, running, but completely dark inside to the point that I could only barely make out the figure of a large man. I don't typically get frightened by much, but something in the air made me tense up, and my heart kind of dropped to my stomach. I stopped and turned to look at the car. I had a feeling that the person driving was watching me intently. The figure in the car was definitely facing me. I could see the reflection from his dash bouncing off of his eyes. I stared back. I figured he was about to yell out to me, but he just sat quietly in a strangely menacing way that I have only ever seen scenes in movies play out. I kinda did a wave at the figure, letting him know I saw him and waited for some type of communication in return. He didn't budge, just stared intently. I returned to pacing away, slightly brisker. After just a few moments I could hear the car slowly roll in reverse, so I turned to face it, but kept pacing backwards. The car kept creeping, slowly. I pulled down my hood and stood still again, waiting for him to pass me. But instead the man slowed to a stop beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and the man and I met eyes. And no words were exchanged at all, and before I could even let out a hello, the man grimaced and accelerated away at a decent pace, almost as if he was disappointed by what he had seen. It doesn't seem like much from how it reads, but I'll never forget how tense that interaction was for me. I've not felt anything like it since. Not creepy, but definitely frightening. I used to manage a small family-owned retail store. It was the 4th of July and the owners of course took the day off and dropped the responsibility on me. We had 2 stock boys bringing up some items on the forklift when I hear Banshee screaming coming from outside the storefront. One of them comes flying through the front door on one leg spewing profanity before collapsing on the ground. I look down and see his actual ankle. Like the bone. Blood is going everywhere. Dude was riding tandem on the forklift, a giant safety no-no, when the driver took a hard turn and sent the kid off the side, running over his foot. The driver screeched to a halt, thought he stopped on the kid's foot, he didn't, so he popped the forklift in reverse and ran over the foot again. Anyway, I learned that day that I keep my cool in emergency situations. Grabbed and elevated the kid's foot, instructed someone to call 911. Always tell a specific person to call 911, never say someone call 911 and another person to get towels to try and stop the bleeding. I held his foot up until the EMTs came. They managed to save the kid's foot, but he had a battle ahead of him. His foot went necrotic and he went septic, I think that's the right term, at one point, but he survived. I don't work there anymore. There were a lot of unsafe practices going on and the owners didn't treat their employees very well. I left about 3 years ago and surprise surprise they shut down about 18 years old and first time ever operating a dozer with an open-air cab and roll cage. Was clearing trees out of a waterway on a farm. All of a sudden I'm knocked out. Come to and blood is running down my face into my lap. Dozer pushing up against a tree, just spinning tracks. My neck and head hurt. I thought I'd been shot or something. No idea. Nobody around me. Wasn't told how to shut off a dozer as it was an older 6C. You don't just turn the key off. Called my dad and he runs over and pulls the idle bar all the way down and it shuts off. We both are clueless as to what happens, then he sees a branch behind my head that I must have drove through and pushed it forward pretty far and it snapped back into the cab and hit me in the forehead. Never saw it or anything. I work in a supermarket, early shift, and part of my job is changing the shelf labels for the price changes each day. Just this Wednesday gone I was putting new labels on a shelf of hand soap when, about 2 foot along the shelf from me, a bottle shot off and landed in the middle of the aisle. I looked along the aisle at my colleague and she just shrugs her shoulders and says happens all the time. I've never directly witnessed anything else, but being one of the first on the shop floor each day, I'm now questioning all the items that I see sitting in the aisles first thing and guessing I can't blame untidy customers for them all. Years ago when I was a senior in high school, I had a day where I wasn't feeling too great. So I decided, as I occasionally did, to skip out on my last 2 classes and head home. That meant no school buses obviously, so I would just walk the 3 miles home. Before the age of computer cell phones this was a pretty long, boring hike to take, so I decided to take a shortcut through some small wooded trail along the creek. Eventually I came across a dead cat lying in the middle of the trail. As I walked around it I noticed another dead cat to my left. Looked to my right and sure enough there was another. Creeped out, I looked behind me and noticed 2 more and yet another 2 in front of me. They were all laid out in a giant circle, with 1 in the middle. Almost like a half-assed pentagon. I speeded up the pace and got the hell out of there. Never took that trail again. Thinking back, a really weird thing is that there was no visible damage to any of the cats, to blood or cuts, the dead. The summer after I graduated from high school, I left work early and went up to my parents' cabin in northern Michigan. Spent that night at the beach watching the sunset. Once the sun went down and it became nearly pitch black, no light pollution, I got to my car and started driving down the highway, M22. After about 10 seconds of being at speed, there was an older Tahoe, late 90s, that started riding my ass and flashing its high beams. So, I got up to about 60 in a 45. They were still on my ass. I pulled off to the side road that my parents' cabin is off of and they took the same turn. I thought this seemed weird cause there's only about 30 to 40 houses on the road. So I went all the way to the end, which is usually a dead end but leads to a maintenance area for the golf course nearby. Truck was still following me. At this point I was freaking out because if I pulled into the house they'd know where we lived and they were still following close by. I took a ton of random turns and the truck kept following every single turn for about 15 minutes. I finally had a chance to make a turn with traffic going through the intersection that gave me a few seconds of a head start. Pulled down the side street, went up 100 yards, turned off all of my lights and waited. Truck slowly drove by the perpendicular street and kept going. Booked it home, pulled my car around the side away from the main road and pulled every curtain. For an 18-year-old, I was scared as hell that night. My sophomore year in college I ran into this guy that was a year younger than me. Let's call him Mitch. Mitch and I were acquaintances that ran in the same circles. He was a nice guy. Smart. And quiet. At parties he would fold these really cool 3D shapes in the corner instead of interacting. He would always just watch everybody. Anyway, I ran into him at a bus stop and I stopped to say hello. We had an awkward chat about our majors, him physics, me chi, and I asked if he had any contact with a mutual friend that went into the army. He said yes and I said great. Could you pass him my number? He opened his wallet and pulled out a piece of paper, the only thing in there. It had my name, university address, and phone number. I was walking down the street when I saw a rusty nail in the road. I picked it up and threw it into an empty house's yard, not helpful I know. After I threw the nail, a man came out of what I thought was an empty house and shouted to me. I freaked out, thinking it was about the nail, and kept walking towards my house. The guy didn't sound mad, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. He started following me to the street and gesturing me to come over, but my gut told me to keep on walking. I get home and see from my house the empty house is now surrounded by cops. At this point I still think it's about the nail. After a while it gets worse and men in full gear show up. I found out later that the house was indeed empty, the men inside were known criminals, and I very much almost ended up a hostage. Dodged the fuck out of that bullet. I work for a company with multiple sites. The couple who own the business tend to acquire new sites from their connections to the Catholic Church. We're talking old church buildings, halls, rectories, really anything they're not using anymore. It wouldn't faze me, but I visit our centers a lot and I have heard some crazy shit from our workers. ONE center is in a really old church, which over the years has been different restaurants and local ventures. When we acquired it, the building was derelict and there was a homeless man living there. Business there always fails after a few years, and to tell you the truth, we're not doing so well ourselves. Everything looks like dark cathedral when you're shutting down, and every sound you hear feels like it's coming from the basement, which is a proper old school crypt vibe. The worst is one in an old house we've occupied for years. We're turning the attic into a new room and two of the workers refuse to go up there. Turns out they had an experience with a trapdoor in the middle of the day. One fell flat on her face, covered in cold sweat after they opened this door. And I wouldn't believe it, but the other worker was there as witness.